Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Business Talk, a podcast presented by Business West and sponsored by Greenfield Cooperative Bank. I'm Joe Bednar, the editor of Business West. We have a great guest on for you today. It's Joshua Weiss. He's the program director for the Master of Science program in Conflict Resolution and Negotiation at Bay Path University. It's quite a mouthful.
It is a mouthful.
Really great to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be with you.
Tell me about how you got into the art and science, I guess, of conflict resolution and negotiation. It seems like such an interesting field.
Yeah, well, like most fields, it wasn't a linear kind of dive into that career. Basically, in college, I kind of studied the Vietnam War and the Holocaust and things along those lines. My grandmother's family actually all died in the Holocaust. And so there was a narrative there for me about conflict that was sort of always in the back of my mind, I suppose you might say. But the sort of twist and turn from a career point of view is that after I graduated from college, I actually went backpacking for a year, bought a round the world ticket that existed back then for $1,500, and you could just keep going west as long as there was an open seat on a flight. And I ended up going through Oceania and Asia and to Europe and North Africa. And the theme that just kept emerging was conflict. I just kept running into it. And when I got back, I thought, I realize I'm just one person here, but like I need to do something about all the conflicts that I've seen and how destructively they were playing out. And so that took me down a road where I went to American University in Washington, D.C. and an international relations degree with a concentration in conflict resolution. And had a professor who was a Syrian Sufi. And if folks don't know what Syrian Sufis are, or Sufis in general, it's a sect of Islam, and Sufis are storytellers. And so he would sit and just tell stories for hours during classes, and it was fascinating, and I was hooked. And so ever since then, I kind of got immersed in all of this and became really passionate. Came and worked at a place called the Program on Negotiation, which is based at Harvard Law School, essentially a negotiation think tank, and really got sucked into it. There were unbelievable people who kept coming through there, doing talks and things along those lines. It just kept pulling me in and in. And I started to focus more and more on negotiation because I noticed that people viewed negotiation a little differently than conflict resolution. Conflict resolution, a lot of times people don't want to admit they have a conflict. They think there's a stigma to it, right? Which isn't really the case from my point of view, but a lot of people view it that way. When it comes to negotiation, people are a little more open and receptive to sort of talking about negotiation that they had or that they need to prepare for, or things along those lines. So left there and got my PhD in conflict analysis and resolution, which most people don't even realize exists. And I've been teaching and training and getting involved in real world negotiations and conflicts ever since.
It's a very universal need, these skills, right? Whether it's in the workplace or in personal relations, right?
It really is. Unfortunately, most people don't get a lot of sort of training or knowledge in how to deal with conflict, how to lead, how to negotiate. And yet we do this every day. I mean, I don't have to tell you that conflicts are everywhere, right? They're part of our daily life, as is negotiation. Too often people tend to think of negotiation in a very formal office setting, but we're negotiating with our coworkers, with our bosses, with our spouses. Our kids seem to be natural negotiators that we have to manage. So it's a life skill. It really is. And students in the program at Bay Path, they come in, most of them are mid-career. They're folks who are, good at what they do is the way that they explain it to me. And meaning technically, whether they're in the sciences or insurance or legal field. But they all say, but when I have to deal with a difficult person, have a difficult conversation, there's a looming conflict, I don't really know what to do. And so that's what we do in the program is help people to understand, how do you strategically approach all of this? And it is absolutely something you can learn like any other skill. I just think, unfortunately, people just don't realize that you can learn it and it's something that you really need.
Yeah. So these are, most of your students they have established careers, but they're just kind of like, they want to kind of pick up this skill to kind of enhance what they're doing already.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them want to move into sort of management and leadership, and so they'll look out there and say, okay, like I'm very good, as a healthcare provider or whatever it might be, but I just don't know how to. I know I'm going to be in a position where I have to oversee people. I have to create a vision. I have to manage difficult situations. And I don't know how to do that.
Hmm.
And so that's where we come in. We do a deep dive into dealing with people. That's how I describe the program. And that's really what negotiation and conflict and leadership is all about. And for me, all of this is really much more about actions than roles. Anybody can be put in a leadership capacity, but we've all worked with people who are quote unquote our leaders. Some are good, right? And they lead in a way we want to follow them. And there's a lot of others who aren't and they don't know how to lead. I had a friend who was a cardiologist and he was asked to take on being the chair of the cardiology department. And he called me in a panic and he said, I'm a cardiologist. I don't know how to lead other doctors. And so, we talked and we discussed some strategies and approaches and things like that. But that's a very common notion that for a lot of people, they're asked because they're competent or capable in what they do from a technical point of view. But when they start to get moved into dealing with people, it's a different deal, a different story.
Probably not the best model for a manager or leader to just assume things are going to resolve on their own.
No. And in fact, it's interesting because for a lot of people, avoidance is really what you're talking about. There's a great saying that I use with my students, which is conflict, unlike wine, does not age well. And I think it's one of those kinds of things where a lot of people, because they don't know what to do, they just try to push it aside and hope it will get better. And it just doesn't. It gets worse. In fact, manageable problems get worse over time. You get more people involved. There's an issue in general that's at the heart of the conflict, and that can metastasize, if I can put it that way, and it starts to add. New layers of things get added on. Camps form. All of the dynamics that we see, when you don't handle conflict effectively. And I would say to your listeners too that for me, conflict is a natural part of the decision making process. It's not a bad thing, which is not what most people think. Most people think, "Oh God, a conflict." But conflict is kind of a natural part of the decision-making process. And what makes it positive or negative is how you handle it, right? If I have the skills and the knowledge to handle a conflict, then 9 times out of 10, it's going to be something that in the end becomes productive, right? Because if we work through something, then I know, hey, Joe and I had our difficulties, but we figured out a way forward. And now I can bring something up in the future if we have another challenge.
The idea of, I guess, coming out stronger with better communication and more understanding, right?
Yeah, in general, absolutely. And I think it's, communication is a really complicated process. It really should have been called miscommunication because that's what's happening most of the time. And so, we have to think a lot about the words that we choose. It's not just what we say, but how we say things to people. We have to think about, well, where is the other person coming from here? Like, if I want to be persuasive to you, I need to know what is going on for you, right? And I think it's a classic mistake that a lot of people make, which is that they think very much about themselves and what they need and what they're trying to get out of a situation, but they're not thinking about the other person. And the reality is you need to be able to say yes as well, right? And so I have to understand, what does Joe need to get out of this as part of this? So it's an interdependent process and an interdependent relationship that's at the heart of all of this. And that's one of the things we really help students to learn is it's, the people you're dealing with are not your enemies. They're not your adversaries. You need them most of the time. So you have to figure out, how do I understand what's going on for Joe in this situation, figure out a creative way to meet that need that he has and to meet the need that I have.
Interesting. Are there, what are some of the examples of the common issues that might arise in the workplace where these skills might come in handy? Are there certain common categories of conflict that keep arising in the workplace? Can you give me some examples or case studies of what you've seen?
So there absolutely are. I mean, I think the biggest thing is, when you've got sort of a zero-sum issue like a budget, right? And who's going to get the bigger piece of the pie, things like that. I think a very big part of the problem is people's mentality. They tend to view things in win-lose terms, in zero-sum terms. And the biggest challenge is, and for me, if I can get people into a mode where they're thinking creatively, most of the time we can find a solution. Mm-hmm. It's that people come in and they've already got in their mind a predetermined solution or predetermined way of thinking. And the problem with that is that anytime we're negotiating, anytime we're dealing with a conflict, we're always working with incomplete information. there are things that you know when you and I sit down that I don't, and vice versa, right? And so, while lots of people want to come in with, say, a plan for how to deal with a situation, that actually causes more problems than is helpful. What you have to do is go in, you have to think a little more like contingency planning, right? So if you think about almost like playing chess, right? If you play chess, you can't script the game out, right? Because the other person is making moves.
Exactly.
So you have to be open to new information coming your way. And so one of the things that we do a lot with students and others that I train in the business world and the medical world and whatever is that I try to help them to learn how to be adaptable and flexible in their mindset. And to, when somebody brings something up that they hadn't considered, that's usually sort of the freak out moment for people, right? And if I can get people to say, okay, I know that it's very likely that the other side's going to share some information that I didn't realize was part of this conflict or part of this situation or what they really needed. How do I take that in and how do I manage that?
Mm.
I think that's part of it is the mindset. I think also other common workplace stuff is, when you have to have a difficult conversation, that what's being presented isn't exactly accurate or whatever it might be, or you might have a personality issue with somebody and you don't really know how to have a conversation with them about how do we work better.
Sure.
Right. So part of it is, and one of the big mistakes people make is they just dive in and have a conversation without preparation, which is a bad idea, and also making all kinds of assumptions. For me, one of the things I try to help people understand is assumptions are sort of the silent killers of effective negotiation and dealing with conflict. Because when you make an assumption about something, it's perfectly logical to you, but I'm not privy to the assumption you're making, right? And so it can take you down a whole different road about what my intentions might be or my beliefs or my perspective on something, as opposed to saying, Josh, what's your take on this? Like, tell me more about why you think this is so important. The people who are the best negotiators and conflict resolvers are folks who listen carefully and ask the best questions. Because part of this is a process of gathering information, right? If I know I'm always working with incomplete information, if I ask you good questions, you're going to create a window for me into your world that helps me to understand what's actually going on.
You're listening to Business Talk, a podcast presented by Business West and sponsored by Greenfield Cooperative Bank. We're speaking today with Josh Weiss. He's the program director for the MS in Conflict Resolution and Negotiation at Bay Pass University. I'm assuming there's probably some misconceptions that people have when it comes to negotiation in the workplace. I read a blog post that you had posted about a half a year ago on the Bay Path website about compromise and how you might have different perspective on that than some people. Can you expound on that? Because I found that article fairly interesting.
Yeah. So there are a number of myths that exist around negotiation, what effective negotiation looks like. So one of them is that compromise is synonymous with negotiation. First of all, if people go into a negotiation with that mindset, what it means is that they typically have to, in their mind, they're thinking, I have to give up something of significant importance in order to reach a deal.
Sure.
The purpose of negotiation is not to reach agreement, unlike what most people think. The purpose of negotiation is to meet your objective as best as possible. If you can do that through an agreement that makes sense for you and meets your needs, great. But too many people think in their head, well, I need to reach an agreement. That's how I succeed here. So let me give up X, Y, and Z. And the problem is when you give up X, Y, and Z, you're not meeting your objectives. It's not that hard to reach an agreement. And I could give up all kinds of things if you and I are negotiating about something. What we want are good agreements that meet what are, our goals, our underlying interests. And so often compromise doesn't do that. Compromise is a race to the bottom. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I was talking to somebody at a party. She said, what do you do? And I said, well, teach negotiation. She said, oh, the best negotiations are where everybody leaves the table a little unhappy. And I said, well, why do you think that? She said, well, come to think of it, my boss said it years ago and it stuck in my head. And I said, well, think about what you're saying, right? You and I have an issue, a situation, right? And so we're both going to leave the table unhappy. Maybe that's necessary. But what I often say to people is you need to replace the notion of compromise and just giving things up to reach agreement with creativity and problem solving. So in most of the negotiations that I've been in my life, if I can get the other negotiator into sort of a creative problem solving way of thinking, we can find a solution. Mm. It's when we get stuck thinking, I have to give this up or I have to give that up in order to get somewhere. Years ago, I did an article. I was interviewed for an article with Forbes India, and the title of the article was "Compromise should be the last stop on the train, not the first." Sometimes compromise is needed, right? But it should be something that you do at the very end after you've tried all kinds of other things. Because the heart of negotiation is understanding what we would call underlying interests. So like people have positions like, I need a raise or I need to have this done by 5 p.m. Friday. That's a position. That's what people want. Interests are why they want those things, why those things are so important. And if you get down to those interests, a lot of the times you can find a solution. I'll give you a quick little story. Sure. So there's a famous book called Getting to Yes. It was written by a couple of guys at Harvard, colleagues of mine. It was written in 1981, and it's still on the bestseller list today. So that ought to tell you something, A, and they're very happy because the royalties are great, right? But they start the book off with two sisters who are arguing over an orange. Okay, and they're in the kitchen, and they each say, no, it's my orange. No, it's my orange. And so what do they do? Well, they do what most people do is they say, well, let's split the difference. Let's compromise, right? So they cut the orange in half. The first sister takes the orange over to the garbage and peels the peel and throws away the peel and starts eating the fruit. She leaves. The other sister goes over to the garbage and peels the orange, throws away the fruit, and uses the peel to make a cake. Had they asked each other and talked to each other about why do you need the orange, they would have both had twice the amount. So it's a really good analogy for how to negotiate effectively by understanding what's really motivating people. A lot of times we don't ask, why is that so important to you? Why does that matter? Right? It's a simple question, and yet people don't ask it. They get stuck in this back and forth positional battle. And so that's why compromise can lead to inefficient solutions. And frankly, if you look throughout history, right, most of the solutions that we've come up with in our world are based on compromises, and they haven't been very good ones, right? Like I could list a few, like the 3/5 compromise, or things along those lines that got an agreement. But what was the cost? Sure. Right, the cost was significant, and it didn't really help anybody. It was expedient. That's usually how I describe it. Is it makes sense to compromise if time and time pressure are the primary dynamic that's pushing something. Like if it's critical that you get a deal done now, then maybe you need to compromise. But if you've got a little bit of time and you can work the problem and think the problem differently, then compromise becomes a much less attractive kind of way of doing things.
The orange story with the sisters, what's my immediate takeaway when I'm listening to this, because I haven't heard that before, is that, proper communication would have completely eliminated the need for any compromise. That seems to me to be applicable to personal relationships, whether it's your parents, your wife or husband or siblings. Just it seems like that there's an element of communication there that these are skills that can really improve relationships and improve lives.
Without question. And I think it's one of those kinds of things that, you don't know what you don't know until you start to learn this. And that's the thing. When students come out of the program, they're like, my world has been transformed because now I think completely differently. When a problem arises, I don't run from it. I lean into it. But I also have the strategic way of thinking about it. I have the analytical capability, and I have the skills to do these kinds of things, right? So, for example, there are a lot of people who struggle with assertiveness. Right? Assertiveness is a critical skill when you're dealing with negotiation and conflict, because if I don't tell you what's most important to me because I'm worried about damaging the relationship, I'm never going to get it. So that's one of the things that we really work with people who struggle to say, I need this, right? And they confuse assertiveness with aggressiveness, right? And one of my colleagues likes to say the difference between assertiveness and aggressiveness is standing on your own 2 feet. Aggressiveness is standing on somebody else's toes, right? It's a big difference.
Yeah.
And so it's learning the art of how do you say things to people in a way that they will take it in and really listen and not feel like you're attacking them, but feel like you're trying to solve the problem. Like I even say to my kids a lot, because I've tried to teach them these skills over time. I say, we have to stay focused on what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And lots of things get in that way, right? Things can be personal. Things can, if you do have time pressure and things like that, everybody starts to feel the anxiety of creeping in on you. And so things like time pressure and power dynamics, when we don't have power, we often feel like there's nothing we can do. And yet that's actually not true because there's a lot of ways of viewing power and thinking about the problem differently.
You mentioned kids. You had mentioned it at the top, at the very beginning of our conversation, you talked about storytelling a little bit, and I'd read about you that you kind of are interested in how storytelling can impact the skill. So I know you've written a lot of books, but you've also written a few for kids.
I have. Yeah.
Tell me about your writing for kids and why that's important.
Well, I think, first of all, and I'm a huge fan of stories and storytelling in general. I mean, obviously they're universal, but if somebody says to you, let me tell you a story, it comes across a lot differently than let me tell you why you're wrong or let me tell you a different way of doing something, right? People find themselves in stories. It's an interesting phenomenon. There's a lot of interesting research that's been done at Stanford University that said when you tell somebody a story from your own experience, they begin to find themselves in that story and they can relate to it in a different way. The reason that I partly wanted to focus on kids is because kids deal with conflict and kids are malleable, right? They learn things at a young age. A lot of times, people our age aren't always so interested in learning new tricks, right? So I think if we can get to kids early and help them to understand that there are alternatives, and in the world we live in where violence and guns and things like that are prevalent and in the news and everything, a lot of people don't know there's a different way, and especially kids. And so the more we can help them to learn the skills at an early age, the easier their life will get. I mean, to be very frank, when I started doing my graduate work and really embraced all of this, I noticed a change in my own life that I wasn't afraid to kind of try to have these conversations anymore. Mm-hmm. And it really helped, because to that point in my life, like I had been accommodating. And so I would let things build up and I would get frustrated. And so I thought, well, okay, if I'm doing that, then lots of other people must be doing it, especially children.
Sure.
And I think one of the big challenges is that kids obviously learn in different ways. And one of them is they learn at home. And so for the parents that are out there listening, you need to model the kind of behavior you want from your kids. You can't say to your kids, do this, speak thoughtfully and politely to your friends, and then sit and yell at your spouse. Mm-hmm. It's got to be, there has to be a level of consistency.
They see it, yeah.
Yeah, kids pick things up. I mean, I remember with my own children, I would do something and then a year later, I would do something slightly different. And my daughter would say, that's not how you did it with her. Right? So they're very perceptive. And like I said, there's a malleability to it. And honestly, writing for kids is a lot of fun. Like I was always a Dr. Seuss and Curious George fan when I was a kid. And think about them. Both of them are really, stories about conflict and negotiation. The two Zacks in the Dr. Seuss, right? Two Zacks. I mean, it's a wonderful metaphor for conflict and how not to do it, right? You have a north-going Zack and a south-going Zack, and they come together and neither will move. Oh. They're too stubborn, right? And so entire highways and things get built around them. And I can tell you, I've met a lot of people through my trainings who are those Zacks. And I say, do you know the two stories, the two Zack stories? Because that's what you're doing right now. And it's, what's interesting is when you hold a mirror up to people, so much of this is psychological. People don't think about their own behavior in this way. And we're very good at rationalizing our own behavior and things like that when it comes to conflict and protecting our reputations and all of that kind of stuff. So, when you learn this, you can learn the concepts externally, right? But if you really want to be good at it, you have to internalize it, which means turning the mirror on yourself and saying, okay, so I don't do everything great. What are the things that I need to work on? And we all have them, right? And so I really challenge the students in the program and the people I train And I say, listen, if you want to get a lot out of this, look at those places where you struggle and think, how can I do this better? Because that is how this all works. And we all have those places. And and that's not to say it's just about focusing on the weaknesses, because we also, all have strengths and we want to build on those things. If somebody's really good at asserting for themselves, that's awesome. And that really helps to, land part of the conversation. But you've also got to be empathic, right? You've also got to try to understand where the other person's coming from. So it's a balance, and it's a walking a fine line a lot of the time between your own needs and the people that you're dealing with and the needs they have, to see if you can find a creative solution.
It's got to be gratifying to do this work, right? Because you can kind of sense the real world impacts of the fact that you are helping to improve workplaces and improve relationships.
It really is. When I was growing up, I realized at a pretty young age I was kind of a helping personality. I got pleasure from helping others and helping them to find a way out of a problem or a challenge. I was always mediating, and I still do a lot of mediation today. And it is really rewarding, because I think there's a lot of despair that goes along with difficult situations and troubling family dynamics. And when you can help people to take a different approach, see things differently, understand how to approach a situation with a strategic way of thinking, it really does change for them. And that's why, as I said, the students, when they come out of the program, they're really transformed. They're like, I have no fear of these kinds of situations anymore, because I feel like I have the knowledge, skills, and ability to deal with it.
We're about at the end. Do you have anything to add that I didn't ask that's important to your work and your?
Well, only just the message that I would have for folks is, these are life skills. It's like learning emotional intelligence. And if you haven't learned this, it will really be of great benefit. And you don't have to necessarily engage in the master's program. You can, but there's a lot of wonderful books, some of which I've written, but there's lots of others that are out there. And most of the books on dealing with conflict and negotiation and effective leadership, they're not very academic in nature. They're written for, you know, sort of the mass audiences. And so they're pretty easy reads, and they have stories like the orange that get lodged in your mind. And so when you're in a situation, you go, well, let me remember that orange story so I don't fall into that trap. So I think part of it is just the notion of challenging yourself and lean in. If this is uncomfortable for you, I think what I've found is, once people can do it once effectively, then they're like, oh, okay, so I guess I don't need to be as afraid of this as I thought. So that would be my big message to folks is, lean in.
It's a great message. And thank you so much for coming on to Business Talk today. I really appreciate the conversation. I enjoyed it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. It was great.
And thank all of you for listening to Business Talk, a podcast presented by Business West and sponsored by Greenfield Cooperative Bank. I'm Joe Bednar, the editor of Business West. We'll see you next time.